Welcome to Inside Asia, a podcast by SEB where we try to connect the dots on what's going on in Asian economies and financial markets. My name is Fredrik Hahnel. I am head of Asia for SEB. We are recording this on the 31st of March in the afternoon here in Singapore. And with me, as so often, I have Sean Yokota, head of markets for Asia. Hi, Sean. How are you doing?
Hi, Fredrik. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing very well too, Sean. I'm happy we could take the time to do this pod in between all other meetings. And this is, of course, a very interesting time to have a discussion on Asia, considering the implications that we see from the war in Iran on Asia. And that's going to be the subject of today. It's obviously a very fluid situation where things are changing by the hour, but we're going to do our best to sort out kind of what impacts we do see and what we could expect to see in different scenarios here in Asia. But before that, as always, why don't you just kick off this pod, Sean, with a few words on markets. I noticed this morning that there are talks of central bank intervention in FX markets, dollar yen trading at very low levels, 160. Same with the Korean won. I think the INR, the Indian currency, also traded at all-time lows very recently. So what's going on?
There are two main things happening. First is that Asia is getting hit more than what's happening in the rest of the world. So if you look at the equity market, S&P in the US is down 7% this year, whereas the broad Asia MSCI index is down 12%. So it's almost double in terms of the losses. Also, if you look at the currency, like you said, the dollar is stronger about 3% kind of across the board. But if you look into Asia, places like Korea, Thailand, Philippines, India, they are down more like 4 to 6%. Again, almost double the impact. And then, of course, since Asian currencies are getting hit, central banks are starting to make some noise. So you see this, what you said with the regulation in India changing, trying to adjust this currency weakness. The second thing that's happening is that you're seeing a transition. So before, when oil prices shot up, people were just worried that, oh, oil's higher, stock markets go lower, and it's a short-term risk. But now this is morphing into part two, where people are starting to worry that this is going to turn into a recession. So we see that already in the prices where things like metal prices, like copper prices, they were holding up very well when the conflict started, but now they're starting to fall. Same thing with like Australian dollar, which is a commodity currency. And also you're seeing it in the yield curve where the yield curve is rising higher because inflation risks are higher. But what you're seeing is like the back end, the 10-year is starting to fall relative to the front, which is showing that growth in the future is at risk. So yes, and that in the end is not good for Asia because we are an export-led economy. So if US is going to go into a recession, no matter how strong you are, you're going to get hit by this. So Frederick, what have you been working on recently?
Yes, I just came back actually a few days ago from a trip to Hong Kong and Shenzhen, where I participated in a CEO delegation that we, as a bank, arranged for a number of our clients. And we visited Huawei in Shenzhen, and it was quite fascinating, as always, to see China's progress in the area of artificial intelligence and a lot of talk about self-sufficiency and focus that we also see reflected in the China's latest 5-year plan. So that was, as always, interesting. And again, seeing Chinese EVs making progress every time I go there. So that was fascinating. It was also interesting to be in Hong Kong and see a little bit more positive, optimism in Hong Kong. It's coming back a little bit. Property market is stabilizing, and it was the biggest IPO market in the world last year, actually. But also interesting to listen a little bit to how they view the situation in the Middle East, with Dubai obviously being significantly impacted by what's going on now in sort of in the sense of, or in its role as a financial center. And you start to hear a little bit of requests from expat families considering relocation to this part of the world. It may only be to a very small extent now, but at least a little bit of a canary in the mine, in the coal mine. So that's what I've been up to. But today we will talk, as we said in the beginning here, about the Iran war and its impact on Asia, And of course, you start to see this happening already now on the ground here. With, for example, the Philippines declaring an energy emergency. They've started implementing a 4-day week. You see rationing and queues at pump stations in countries like Thailand and Burma. Countries are gradually running out of gas. You see shortage of fertilizers just as we are entering the planting season, which could, of course, have big impacts on inflation, food inflation. And we start to hear, of course, also talk of U.S. military assets being moved from the from Asia to the Middle East, potentially leaving Asia in quite a vulnerable situation with a bit of a shift in the power balance. With when I'm thinking, of course, of North Korea and China and Japan and Korea and the Philippines on the other side being U.S. allies. So I thought we'd talk about these two things today: the economic impact and then the geopolitical impact. And Sean, why don't you start by just laying out the facts in terms of Asia's dependence on oil and other imports through the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the most obvious impacts on inflation rate. You talked a little bit about that in the beginning, but if you expand a little bit on that, and then we take it from there.
Before I go to the numbers of energy, let me first kind of just put a framework around how we think about this. So whenever there's an oil shock, there are multiple channels where it hits Asia or any economies. And so it kind of goes in sequence. So first is the very easy one. What is the energy impact or the cost of importing higher oil prices? But then, like you said, second thing is what happens to inflation, and then what happens to interest rates because of inflation, and then the foreign exchange impact. And then the third impact that hits probably Asia harder is that it has a negative impact on government debt because they don't want to pass through higher energy prices to the consumers for votes. So the government takes that in and does that by increasing its debt. And then finally, the last part is that then is the geopolitics of diversifying your energy sources, but that's kind of a longer term thinking. Just one last thing I want to include is that because this is the Middle East, it tends to hit Asia in one last way. It's more for India and Philippines where it hits remittances because a lot of Indians and Filipinos work in the Middle East and they earn income there and send that money back to Asia. And so if that's not there, then that hurts the currency, it hurts consumption because the families back home don't have money to spend. But those are kind of the basic framework we set. And then now, if we kind of go into the energy impact on Asia and the numbers. So if we look at oil, so about what goes through the Strait of Hormuz, about 83% or somewhere around there, it is headed to Asia. So when that's closed, it has a very big impact on Asia. But the other one number that's kind of good to know is that from Asia's point of view, it doesn't get everything from the Middle East. It does have some diversification. So probably about for oil, 50% of the oil comes from the Strait of Hormuz, the consumption of it. And now, if I kind of break up the numbers, uh, I'll kind of do it by buckets where the very highly exposed countries. So the highest one is Japan, where 90% of its oil comes from over there. And then places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, it's like 80%. And then you have like the middle high ones, where 70% of its oil comes from the Middle East. That's for Korea and Taiwan. And then you get a little bit lower, which is India, where they get like 55% from the Middle East. And then at the very end, you have a little bit more underexposed ones, where China's there, where China only gets about 50% of its oil from the Middle East. And then you get to the lower ones like Indonesia, Vietnam, where it's only about 30%. So that's kind of the basics of the oil. And if you look at the LNG market, it's kind of similar to that outline and the percentage. It's just that you have two countries, which is Malaysia and Indonesia. They don't have to worry about it because they have their own natural gas, so they don't rely on the LNG. So those are just kind of the quick facts when it comes to the energy exposure.
How not only how much of their oil and LNG that they get from the Middle East, but also a little bit how dependent they are on this input for their own energy mix. Because if you look at the different countries, is very very different, right? I think the most extreme one is Bangladesh, with 50% of its electricity coming from gas, and gas cannot be stored for too long, and they don't have any reserves, so they are already by now significantly impacted. I talked about the 4-day working weeks in the Philippines, and there are many other stories at the moment with officials being asked to dress lightly and turn off the aircon in some countries, etc., etc. But if we could go from north and a little bit south and talk a little bit about how dependent are countries on oil and gas for their energy production, as well as how well they are prepared for this with reserves. If we start with Japan and Korea, you mentioned how incredibly dependent they are on imports from the Middle East. I think you said roughly 90% of their oil coming from there. How does it look for them if we start with these two countries in terms of reserves and ability to buy gas in the market?
When we talk about reserves, it's actually the opposite of how dependent they are to the the oil imports. So, for example, Japan and Korea, since they know they're very highly exposed to Middle Eastern oil, those guys are the ones who have the highest amount of reserves. Also, they are kind of relatively wealthier countries, so they can withstand this much better than if you have a low income country like Bangladesh, who doesn't have that much buffers. So if we look at the kind of the reserves, Japan has about 8.5 months of reserves of oil that they can withstand. And then when you get to Korea, it's like 6 to 7 months of oil reserves that they have. So they've slowly tapped into them, but because they know they're exposed, they're a little bit more prepared and ready for this.
Yeah, and if we look at Taiwan, a little bit a similar situation. I mean, they're very much dependent on imports of LNG and I think also helium for their manufacturing of semiconductors. And there's talk of them now being able to buy gas in the international market. I think it's turning more towards Australia and the US, and that they are able to secure gas for their manufacturing needs. Is it the same in Japan and Korea? And could you also say something on their nuclear capabilities or other sources of energy?
Of course, like pretty much everybody in Asia, especially Northeast Asia, they have always been reliant on energy and commodities as a source of imports. And that's why they're so good at exports because they don't have anything to sell. So they have to import some energy and make some kind of product that everybody else wants and sell that to the world. So the economic model has always led to reliance on imports of commodities and then production of goods to sell. Um, but yes, so over the years, I think nuclear was the big one that they were trying to diversify and increase. But as you know, Japan had nuclear facilities quite a bit, but because of the Fukushima incident, they've shut it down and slowly bringing that back up. So at the moment, yes, Korea and Japan, they're the same. They're increasing the nuclear capabilities, but of course, these are democracies and they are hard to get through popularity-wise. So, from a short-term point of view, like a 6 months point of view, I don't think they have really good solutions on how to diversify away from reliance on natural gas or oil that they import from the Middle East.
So big impact, obviously, on these markets, and that's also, as you mentioned in the beginning, what we see in their currencies and stock markets as well. If we move a little bit towards the south, and we stop we start in Japan and Korea, and then we look at China, the Middle Kingdom, which I'm very interested to hear your comment. But I would argue that they're least exposed. Probably they have very good reserves. I mean, this is a country that has prepared themselves for these kind of scenarios for a very, very long time. If you listen to Chinese politics, they always discuss self-reliance and making sure that they can stand volatility in the global markets. You correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've read is that they have roughly 120 to 130 days of crude reserves. They have massive reserves of minerals, fertilizers, etc. And they also have very robust refining capabilities and oil companies that are state-owned and that they can control. And they have a mechanism in China whereby there's quite a bit of lag between world price markets and local markets in China. They probably have a better ability to postpone any impact from these price increases. They bought all this oil that they have stored at much lower prices, and it seems like they're gonna kind of mix new oil that they get through with this oil, and therefore can keep down the prices. It's also a country that hasn't had much inflation, and where their producer price inflation has been negative, and it's definitely going to come back here into positive territory in this situation. But that also makes them a little bit less maybe vulnerable to this inflation impulse that we can expect to see now. And then, of course, they have diversified their imports for a long time, and they have, of course, the ability to import much more oil from Russia directly. And they, of course, also have big backup capacity that we will also, I guess, talk about when we talk about Southeast Asia. But China definitely has a lot of capability and capacity in terms of coal burning and the coal as a base for electricity production as well. So I would say, because of all these different reasons that I mentioned, China is probably pretty well positioned here. What's your view on this, Sean?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. China's probably the least exposed to what's happening in the Middle East. And like you said, yeah, they have about 4 months of reserves in oil that they can withstand. And kind of in retrospect, I understand why Putin and Xi became friends for things like this. Maybe they knew this was coming. Uh, so that was perfect partnership. So all the gas pipelines that they can get, the oil that they can get from Russia, I think it helps out quite a bit. In addition to all the diversification and renewables that they've been building up. So, and I think it's a positive for them that because of this, whatever you source from China, it probably shows up faster. They're a more reliable producer. So, like even as a manufacturer, I think their stock value has gone up relatively to other parts of Asian countries.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll refrain from commenting on why Xi and Putin became friends. I'll leave that to you, Sean. But I agree with you definitely that we might see now a bit of a replay from the COVID times, right, when China stood out as a very reliable manufacturing base. It increased their market share in the international export markets and could keep their supply chains very stable. That's quite likely that something similar will play out now. Not as dramatically then, but definitely China seems to be able to stand strong in this situation. There are other ways, though, that China is impacted. Of course, I mean, it's a very export dependent market today. Its GDP growth is very dependent on its exports growing, and if you look at countries exposed indirectly to this and the recession risks that you talked about in the beginning, you can see that 60% of Chinese exports goes to Europe or Asia. So that's definitely one potential impact that I would mention here. Another one is, of course, it does import goods. We talked about oil and other energy here mainly, but we shouldn't forget that China also is an importer of fertilizers that I mentioned at the start. It's an importer of food stuff, quite a lot of food, and of course, food inflation would have a negative impact on China. But I also want to see one other. We're going to talk a little bit about geopolitics later in the pod, but it's quite interesting to also note that, of course, with the US now using up a lot of military equipment and ammunition, etc., there's going to be a massive need for manufacturing in the US of these goods, and of course, one thing they will need then is rare earth, where China has a total dominance in the world market. And hence, you can also see how the US will actually increase its dependence on China, and China will have a more even increased leverage on the US as we move ahead with the Xi Jinping and Trump meeting that was supposed to take place already, but has been postponed into May, I think it is now. And this trade war that's ongoing, I think that will of course also be impacted by this. But should we move on to Southeast Asia and talk a little bit about that? There, of course, we see economies face more acute, I would say, liquidity or kind of energy situation with LNG shortfalls, other oil shortfalls, and at the same time also fiscal constraints that limit their subsidy capacity to a larger extent than we would see in North Asia and in China. As I said earlier, I think we already now see an accelerating near-term coal usage. I don't know if that's why we see a bit of smog here in Singapore the last week or so, or if there's any other reason. But we definitely have already started to see more coal burning in these countries. And we've also started to hear more about nuclear ambitions in the region. But of course, long term, we can expect to see more also renewable investments where China will stand very strongly, well positioned for that. But I hand over to you, Sean, if you want to comment a little bit on Southeast Asia, or if you also want to talk a little bit about India.
Yeah, so first on Southeast Asia, like you mentioned at the beginning, because they're putting in measures to because there's not enough oil to slow down commutes or airplanes, then of course you get hit on growth pretty quickly. In addition to that, these lower income countries, the energy component and the food component is higher in the CPI because they're more reliant on these products. So the hit on inflation is much faster than if you're in Korea or Japan. So that's why you're seeing more pressure on these currencies as well. That even Indonesian rupiah, peso, they're all getting hit much more. And then it kind of pressures the central banks to maybe have to hike interest rates when growth is already slowing down. So yes, I think they are in a bit more vulnerable position, even though their reliance on oil from Middle East is lower compared to North Asia. And then the last thing is that this current account balance of payments things where India, Indonesia are the two places where they run a current account deficit. That means they're always importing more goods than exporting. So when you have higher oil prices, it hits them much more, and that's why you see the stress on the currency. And then if I move over to India, of course, India is 80% of their energy is imported. It's just that they are a little bit better in diversifying. And then they're allowed to get oil from Russia now. So that's kind of helped out. But for India, I think the biggest impact is on LPG. So that's like a fuel that's used for kind of lower income families to heat up, to cook, basically, or to warm up their houses, and that's where they're really reliant on. So as those prices go up, I mean, there's not a huge economic impact, but I think there's a political impact that when people's inflation goes up, they're going to vote against the ruling party, and I think that puts a little bit of pressure on Modi going forward.
Yeah, and let's see. I mean, it was a few months ago that you saw all these announcements by US tech firms to make massive investments in data centers in India. And of course, that's very dependent on electricity supply. So I think from different angles, it's quite sensitive to India. But as you say, once they are allowed to buy oil from Russia again, that of course alleviates a little bit the situation there.
Yep, exactly.
Should we then move on to geopolitics and make an attempt at it? It's of course a complex, subject to talk about, but let's at least try to sort of a little bit where things are shifting in Asia now, and how this crisis impacts the power balance in the region. As I mentioned earlier in the pod, we've seen U.S. troops and U.S. military equipment being moved to some extent, at least over to the Middle East. And as we know, the U.S. is a very important security guarantor in the region. You usually say that Japan, Korea, and the Philippines are U.S. allies. The U.S. supplies Taiwan with military equipment. The U.S. is involved in other parts of Asia as well, of course. And usually what the comment down here in Southeast Asia is that the US is the guarantor for security, while China is the biggest market for many of these economies. So it's a very fine balance here. But if you look at this power balance that is now at least to some extent shifting, of course, I think a lot of countries in the region will be worried. They're worried about threats from China. They're worried about threats from North Korea. Let's start to talk about the Middle Kingdom here, China, and their view on this. I've seen that Official statements have been the usual. They've been condemning the U.S. and Israel for the killing of the Ayatollah Khamenei. They have condemned the airstrikes, labeling it as grave violations of Iran's sovereignty and international law, which is very typical for China to say these things. But otherwise, they've been rather quiet since then. And of course, as usual, if you look at this, China is in reality very transactional. They look at this from an economic and business point of view. It looks after its economic interests in the region, which are quite big. It has, as we've read, managed to get some ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has said that oil trade settled in China's currency, the renminbi, can go through, which is quite interesting considering all these discussions of the petrodollar system and whether any other currency could ever replace the US dollar. We have seen renminbi being settled, sorry, oil being settled in renminbi with Saudi Arabia and other countries to some extent in the region, but now Iran is emphasizing this when it looks at the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is indeed, you could say, an ally, of China, but at the same time, they're not particularly close ideologically or in any other sense, except maybe more, I would say, economically. But still, Iran is a full member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a kind of a security membership organization with Russia and China, as well as several um, Central Asian countries being part of it. Iran is a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's also a full member of the BRICS organization, where Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa started this kind of organization for as a counterweight to the West in the global South, and several other countries have over time also joined this organization. One of them is Iran. What do you think are China's main interests here in Iran or in the Middle East in general?
Like you said, it's I think economic interest is still the number one, where Iran and China were on good terms, but they haven't really come to their aid. And then President Xi is going to meet Donald Trump in May. I- it's a it's a weird relationship that they're going to meet up and agree to something. And I think like in this part of the economy right now for China, they're really reliant on exports, and they have to change whether it's local government debt structures or the property bubble that I think the economics right at this moment is trumping any decisions. So that's why I think they're relatively quiet on this. But I think going forward, if anything, I feel like they're going to accelerate the Belt and Road initiative that they had because of these supply chain issues. So just building more infrastructure over land, going to Europe, so you don't have to rely on sea, working with their partners. Um, there's always been this talk in Thailand about building a strait so that you don't have to go through Singapore and the Malacca Strait. So maybe China will try to fund those projects as well. But I think it's the economic infrastructure that they will accelerate the process based on what's happened.
How about other powers in Asia? As I said earlier, U.S. has been a security guarantor for many countries in the region and has military bases in Japan, Korea, and Philippines, etc. I mean, these countries are allies of the U.S., but they see these movements now. How do you think? How do you think the governments of Japan and Korea see this now? Are we going to see more military spending in these countries? Do they feel less protected by the US, or what's your view there? And what do you read in Japanese press, for example?
Yeah, so when it comes to geopolitics in the region, we've talked about this many times, but always the flashpoint is going to be about Taiwan and what's going to happen there. So yes, because of what's happening in the Middle East, there is troops moving from Japan to the Middle East. So I think Japan, some of the numbers that are out is that about 5% of the army, the personnel, they've moved to the Middle East. So they have about 50,000 U.S. military people and about 2.5 or 2,000 have moved to the Middle East. So yeah, 5%. But I think more in the number of ships. It's the I don't know if it's official, but they say about 20% of the ships that were in Japan have moved to the Middle East. So that's a significant amount. And so Japan, in order to fight back on that, they have to spend more on their own domestic self-defense as U.S. troops are moving. And then on Korea's case, there hasn't been any kind of specifics that's been moved to the Middle East, but it's more from like the missiles have been redeployed from the defense missiles from what's happening in Korea over to Middle East. So a smaller impact for Korea, but it's the same. I think both of these countries they'll have to maybe get the Trump NATO call as well to spend your own money and build up your own defenses.
I don't, think we should speculate too much on a, potential military action from China on Taiwan, because it's something that's constantly being discussed. And what I read now is that, of course, usually the argument is that the economic cost or the reputational cost for China is too high. There's no reason for them to act as long as Taiwan behaves and doesn't declare independence, and they don't go too far in their cooperation with the West, etc. As a matter of fact, I'm going to Taiwan tomorrow morning, so I will know more very soon about the situation there.
I guess you're not
I'm
too worried.
no, I'm going there with my family, so I hope that tells everything. But of course, we've also seen some volatility in the military commission in China, with 5 of the 7 members having been fired by Xi Jinping. It's only him and one more person left. And that's going to be the case probably, unless they appoint someone before that, until the party congress this autumn, the next party congress. But I thought, instead of sort of speculating on that, we could talk a little bit, maybe as a final part of this discussion, on the choke point that the Taiwan Strait actually is. If you could give a bit of statistics on how much of global trade goes through, container traffic, for example, how much goes through the Taiwan Strait, and how important is this as a potential future choke point at some point, who knows, for this region?
Yeah, sure. So this impacts mostly the northern Asian economies, so Japan, Korea, China, and Taiwan. So if you look at from an oil point of view, it's probably half as important as Hormuz. So about 20 million barrels go through Hormuz, but Taiwan is about half of that, 8 to 10. It's much bigger for the container industry. So about maybe half of the global container fleet capacity goes through that strait, which is humongous, versus like a 10% in Strait of Hormuz. And then from an economic point of view, like I said, it's mostly a Japan, Korea, China issue, where 25% of their total trade or exports go through there. So yes, it's not energy as much, but it's just a global exports of manufactured goods that's going to be impacted. And I guess you sort of saw that during the COVID period on what can happen at the beginning.
Yeah, and I would really highly recommend to any listener who's interested to kind of take a closer look at the map and just see what it looks like. The Taiwan Strait is one thing, but if you look at the entire South China Sea, that, of course, because the Taiwan Strait you can actually avoid, and you can go outside of Taiwan if you want to ship goods to Japan and Korea. But if you take the entire South China Sea into consideration, it's a little bit more difficult, and it's a very, very important water for this traffic, as you mentioned earlier, Sean. And that's also why China has, such a big, or taken a number of the islands there and built up a military capacity, because they've known for a very, very long time, as long as I have been a student of China, it's been a subject discussed. China is securing those waters. They know they're very, very vulnerable, and that they import all the oil that they import over the waterways comes through that strait. So for China, this is, of course, incredibly interesting. So in many of these discussions on how things could go wrong in this part of the world, There's always this discussion on, could it be more of a blockade? Could it be an embargo, for example, on Taiwan, where Taiwan, people tend to forget that Taiwan is not only one island, it's actually a number of smaller islands around it as well, some of them being very, very close to the Chinese mainland. And the waters between Taiwan and China are considered international waters by the entire world, except China, actually, that considers that Chinese waters. And today, international ships can sail through there freely, but there's always this tension. So more out of interest, we're not talking about this as a speculation of what could go wrong, but of course it's an interesting subject to discuss in times like this, that there are many other similar choke points in the world that would be very, very significantly affected in times of military conflict. And we shouldn't forget that the entire subject of raw material and access to oil is nothing new to this region. If you look back to the Second World War, for example, that was the entire, or the main reason, at least for Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, because the U.S. had at that time implemented an oil embargo on Japan. Japan was at the time importing a lot of oil and steel from the U.S., and suddenly they didn't get access to that, and then they had invaded Korea and parts of China, and then continued to invade the rest of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and down Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, etc., in order to get access to raw material. And one of the reasons they attacked the U.S. was to sort of prevent them from stopping Taiwan in this part of the world. So a little bit of history there as well. This is nothing new to the region, and I think that's been on the radar for many of these countries for a very long time, to build up this resilience. But as we can see now, with this conflict in Iran, that the region is still incredibly sensitive to these kind of disturbances, and we will definitely continue to see an impact on inflation and the economies and other things out in the region going forward.
Yeah, let me just add. There's a good podcast from it's CSIS, which is a U.S. think tank. It's called China Power, that's recently out, and they're talking about how with the Taiwan possible conflict in the future, because U.S. is so far away relative to China to protect, U.S. needs quite a bit of energy to protect Taiwan, and so that could be one reason why Venezuela and Iran, all these energy securities, very important if they really want to support Taiwan in the long run. But it's a good one to listen to.
Before we finish off, Sean, should we say something just about what should companies from Europe that are active in this part of the world, anything they should think of? I can just share that I heard from two of our clients in India very recently that they had pretty big impact on their supply chains. The supplies were severely delayed, and they expect quite a lot of price increases and cost increases for the manufacturing in India, as one example of a direct impact. But anything you want to share or think we should discuss before we end?
Yeah, I think it is the supply chain topic that Iran's probably not the last place that's going to have a conflict. So these supply chain disruptions, it could go anywhere in the world. So as I mentioned, as a company, if the Malacca Strait here in Singapore gets blocked, or if something happens in the Taiwan Strait, um, I know companies have already looked at their supply chain from COVID or ESG perspective and the tariffs, but I think now you have to do an extra layer of all these areas that can be blocked and how to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, and I believe also that with all these impacts, that this will have indirect impacts on access to electricity, for example, or in the direct impact on energy prices will also be something to be taken into consideration when investing in the region. Some countries will stand out stronger in this environment, China being one of the obvious ones, but it will be very interesting to see if this conflict continues, how India, for example, is affected. Can they guarantee access to energy? Can they guarantee supply chain security, etc.? What will other countries do, and how will this look for companies with investments in these different countries? And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Sean, do you want to summarize our podcast with in 10 seconds?
Yeah, sure. Three short conclusions. One, on the economic side, that China is the least exposed, but if there is a global recession, they're going to get sick just as well. And then on the geopolitics side, the Taiwan risk maybe on the margin have increased with less U.S. military presence in Asia. And then lastly, maybe for corporates, that they do need to kind of relook at the other possible supply chain shocks here in Asia.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Sean. And thank you, everyone, for listening in today. We look forward to speaking to you soon again. Thank you and goodbye.